In the spring of 2021, a rancher named Dale Hoffman was checking fence line on the eastern edge of his property in Sioux County, Nebraska, when he noticed something moving through the short grass about 40 yards ahead of him. He stopped. The animal stopped. He has described what happened next as a moment of pure cognitive dissonance, a situation where what his eyes were telling him could not be reconciled with what his brain believed was possible. The animal looking back at him was a black-footed ferret. He knew what it was, immediately. His family had ranched that ground for 3 generations, and he had grown up hearing the old-timers talk about the ferrets that used to run the prairie dog towns before they disappeared. He had seen photographs. He had read enough to know what he was looking at. He had also read enough to know that the nearest official black-footed ferret recovery site was not close to his land. Not close in the sense that matters ecologically. Not close in the sense that would explain what he was seeing. He stood there for what he estimates was about 30 seconds before the ferret vanished into a prairie dog burrow. He stood there for another several minutes after that, trying to work out what it meant. He reported the sighting to Nebraska Game and Parks. The response he received was polite, professional, and reflected an institutional uncertainty that he found, in retrospect, more interesting than a confident explanation would have been. Wildlife staff told him that black-footed ferret sightings outside of established recovery sites were not impossible, that individual animals were known to disperse, that the report would be logged and followed up on. What Hoffman did not know at the time, and what he learned only later, was that his sighting was not the first of its kind from that general region. It was not the second. It was not even the 5th. Something was happening in a stretch of short grass and mixed grass prairie in the Nebraska Panhandle and into the adjacent corners of Wyoming and South Dakota that did not fit neatly into the established narrative of black-footed ferret recovery. And the people responsible for managing that recovery were working through what it meant, with a combination of genuine excitement and genuine caution that had not yet translated into a public statement. If you have followed wildlife conservation stories at any level of depth over the past 30 years, you know the black-footed ferret's trajectory. It is one of the most dramatic near-extinction and recovery narratives in American conservation history, which is a field not short on dramatic narratives. The species was declared extinct in 1979. That declaration was not careless or premature. It reflected the genuine disappearance of every known population from every known site across a former range that had stretched across the Great Plains from southern Canada to northern Mexico, following the grassland and prairie dog colonies that constituted both the ferret's primary prey and its primary habitat. The black-footed ferret is an obligate associate of prairie dog ecosystems in a way that few species are obligate associates of anything. It does not merely prefer prairie dogs, it requires them. Prairie dogs constitute roughly 90% of its diet. It hunts them underground in their own burrow systems, which requires a body plan that is almost absurdly specialized, long and tubular and flexible, built for navigating tunnels rather than open terrain. It raises its young in prairie dog burrows. It thermoregulates through prairie dog winters by using the insulation of the burrow network. Remove the prairie dogs, and you have not degraded black-footed ferret habitat. You have eliminated it entirely. The prairie dog is one of the most systematically persecuted animals in the history of the American West. The federal government conducted poisoning campaigns against prairie dog colonies for most of the 20th century, viewing them as competitors with livestock for forage and as hazards to horses and cattle that might break a leg in a burrow entrance. Ranching interests, agricultural interests, and a federal bureaucracy operating under an agricultural extension model that treated native grassland wildlife as an obstacle to production rather than a component of a functioning ecosystem, combined to reduce prairie dog populations across the Great Plains by an estimated 98% from their pre-European contact levels. The black-footed ferret, dependent on an animal that had been reduced to 2% of its former abundance across a landscape that had been fundamentally restructured, had no path to survival. It followed the prairie dog off the available landscape. The 1979 Declaration of Extinction was the formal acknowledgement of an ecological collapse that had been in progress for decades. The rediscovery in 1981 near Meeteetse, Wyoming, is one of those conservation stories that feels almost too convenient to be real. A ranch dog bringing a dead ferret to a farmhouse door, the owners recognizing it as something unusual. The subsequent survey that found a remnant wild population of somewhere between 100 and 130 individuals clustered in the prairie dog towns of the Shirley Basin. It was a genuine miracle in the secular sense of the word, a population that had survived without anyone knowing it existed, giving the recovery program a starting point it had been certain it no longer had. What followed was not simple. A sylvatic plague outbreak in 1985 devastated the Meeteetse population. Wildlife managers made the controversial decision to bring the remaining animals into captivity for an emergency breeding program that was, at the time, one of the most ambitious captive breeding efforts ever attempted for a North American mammal. It worked. The captive population grew. Reintroduction efforts began in 1991. By the mid-2000s, black-footed ferrets were established at multiple reintroduction sites across their former range in Wyoming, South Dakota, Montana, Colorado, Arizona, Kansas, and Utah. The population today is estimated at somewhere between 300 and 400 wild individuals, with additional animals in the captive breeding program. It is not recovered in the biological sense of a self-sustaining population that no longer requires intensive management, but it is alive in the wild in a way that was not considered possible 40 years ago. The program is one of the unambiguous conservation success stories of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Understanding why the unauthorized appearances in Sioux County, Nebraska, are strange requires understanding the geography and mechanics of the recovery program. Black-footed ferret reintroduction does not happen opportunistically. It requires extensive preparation. A reintroduction site must have sufficient prairie dog acreage, usually measured in the thousands of acres of active colony, to support a viable ferret population. It must have some protection from the two factors that kill black-footed ferrets most consistently in the wild: sylvatic plague and secondary poisoning from rodenticide use on nearby properties. It requires landowner cooperation, either through ownership by a federal or tribal agency, or through formal agreements with private landowners who commit to managing their prairie dog colonies in ways compatible with ferret survival. The process of establishing a reintroduction site, from initial survey to first animal release, typically takes years. It is not a process that produces surprises in the form of animals appearing 40 miles from the nearest prepared site without anyone having put them there. The closest established reintroduction site to the area where the Sioux County sightings have been occurring is in the Thunder Basin National Grassland in Wyoming, to the west. There are smaller sites in South Dakota to the northeast. The distances involved are not trivial in black-footed ferret terms. Ferrets are not long-distance dispersers in the way that some carnivores are. They are associated with specific prairie dog towns and do not typically undertake the kind of extensive overland travel that would bring them to a completely new site, dozens of miles from the nearest population. A young male black-footed ferret, in peak dispersal condition, moving through contiguous prairie dog habitat, might travel 20 or 30 miles. The sightings in Sioux County are coming from properties that are substantially beyond that range from any known reintroduction site, moving through terrain that includes significant breaks in prairie dog coverage, where a ferret crossing open ground without the protection of a burrow system would be extremely vulnerable to predation by golden eagles, great horned owls, coyotes, and badgers. This is why the sightings are strange. Not strange in the sense that they are impossible to explain. Strange in the sense that none of the straightforward explanations are fully satisfying. And the more interesting explanations, the ones that would be genuinely significant, if they turned out to be correct, are the ones that the available evidence has not yet ruled out. And strange in the sense that the volume of reports, the consistency of the descriptions, and the geographic clustering of where the sightings are occurring suggests something more than the random appearance of individual dispersing animals that got lost. If you find this kind of story interesting, the kind where the data and the official explanation don't quite line up, and where the gap between them might mean something important is happening, stay with this. These are the stories worth paying attention to. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The reports began accumulating in a systematic way around 2019, though there are accounts from ranchers in the region that suggest sightings were occurring earlier than that, without anyone having a clear mechanism for reporting them, or any confidence that a report would be taken seriously. The 2019 reports came through a combination of channels. Some came directly to Nebraska Game and Parks from landowners who had seen the animals and knew what they were. Some came through the Black-Footed Ferret Recovery Implementation Team, the multi-agency coordinating body that manages the recovery program across all jurisdictions. Some came through informal networks among ranchers and wildlife enthusiasts in the region, people who passed word between themselves before deciding whether to contact an agency. By the end of 2021, wildlife managers were aware of at least 11 separate sighting reports from private properties in a roughly oval area in the Nebraska Panhandle, centered on Sioux County but extending into adjacent Dawes and Sheridan counties. Not all of those reports had been verified. Not all of them were from observers whose identification could be treated with complete confidence. But a significant number were from ranchers and landowners who had good enough looks at the animals, in some cases multiple sightings of the same or similar animals over multiple seasons, to make the identification credible. The verification problem is the first and most important complication in this story. Black-footed ferrets are not easy to confirm. Camera traps are the standard tool for documenting their presence, and they are effective when deployed at active prairie dog towns where ferrets are known to hunt. But deploying camera traps across private land, in an area as large as the one where the Sioux County reports are originating, requires landowner cooperation at a scale that takes time to develop, particularly when the landowners have reason to be cautious about what verification might mean for how their land is managed. The Endangered Species Act protections that attach to black-footed ferret presence on private land are not simple. A confirmed ferret population on a private property creates a regulatory situation that can constrain the landowner's options in ways that directly affect their ranching operation. Prairie dog control, which most ranchers in this region conduct routinely, becomes complicated when a listed species that depends entirely on prairie dogs is present on the property. This is not a hypothetical concern. It is the lived experience of private landowners across the West who have watched the relationship between endangered species presence and land use flexibility play out in ways that did not always favor them. The result is a documented pattern in which private landowners sometimes do not report suspected endangered species presence on their land, or report it through informal channels that do not trigger formal agency response, or actively discourage the kind of survey activity that would produce confirmed documentation. This dynamic is not unique to black-footed ferrets or to Nebraska. It is one of the structural tensions in American endangered species policy that conservationists, economists, and legal scholars have been writing about for decades. The Endangered Species Act was designed to protect species from the direct consequences of human activity. It was not designed with a sophisticated appreciation of the incentive structures it would create for private landowners. And those incentive structures have, in some cases and in some regions, worked against the law's stated purposes. A landowner who reports a black-footed ferret may be protecting the species. They may also be accepting a significant restriction on their land use options, with no compensation and no certainty about how long those restrictions will apply. The rational response to that calculus, for a rancher operating on thin margins in a region where prairie dog management is a routine part of keeping pasture productive, is not always to pick up the phone and call the state wildlife agency. The people working on black-footed ferret recovery are acutely aware of this dynamic. The recovery program has spent years developing voluntary landowner incentive programs, cooperative management agreements, and relationship-building frameworks designed to make landowners partners in recovery rather than involuntary hosts for a listed species. Those programs have had real success in some contexts. The Private Land Reintroduction Program that established ferrets on the American Prairie Reserve in Montana and on several ranches in South Dakota and Wyoming through partnerships with the conservation community represents the kind of cooperative model that the recovery program depends on for long-term viability. Black-footed ferrets cannot be recovered on public land alone. The prairie dog habitat that remains in sufficient quantity and quality to support viable ferret populations in the Great Plains is substantially on private land. Recovery without private land cooperation is not possible, and the legal and regulatory framework that private landowners navigate when a listed species appears on their property is one of the most persistent obstacles to achieving that cooperation. This is the context in which the Sioux County sightings are occurring, and it matters for understanding both the significance of what appears to be happening and the complexity of the response. The private land in question is ranching country. Some of it has been in the same family for generations. The owners are not universally hostile to conservation, and several of the ranchers who have reported sightings have done so voluntarily and with what appears to be genuine interest in understanding what is happening on their land. But the broader community of landowners in the area is watching how those who have stepped forward are treated, what agency engagement looks like in practice, and what the presence of ferrets on their land would mean for their ability to manage it. The conservation community's job in this situation is not just scientific. It is also diplomatic, and the diplomacy is proceeding against a background of historical grievances about federal land management and endangered species policy that do not dissolve simply because the species in question is charismatic and the recovery story is compelling. The question of where these animals are coming from has been approached from several directions. The dispersal explanation, the idea that animals from Thunder Basin or from one of the South Dakota sites have been making their way east and south into Nebraska through some combination of individual movement and undocumented habitat, is the simplest and most conservative. It does not require any assumption that these are anything other than individual ferrets doing what ferrets occasionally do, which is move. It does require some accounting for the distance and the habitat gaps involved, and the clustering of the sightings in a relatively small geographic area suggests something more structured than the random wandering of individual animals. If these were isolated dispersers arriving from different source populations at different times, the geographic distribution of the sightings would be expected to be more diffuse. What has been reported instead is a pattern of sightings concentrated in an area that has good prairie dog coverage, specifically several large connected prairie dog towns on private ranch land in the western part of Sioux County, that anyone doing a desktop habitat assessment would identify as suitable ferret habitat that simply has no ferrets in it, officially. The possibility that the animals represent a remnant, undocumented population, animals or descendants of animals that survived the 20th century collapse without ever being detected, is the most scientifically interesting explanation, and the one that is hardest to evaluate without genetic data. The history of black-footed ferret discovery in North America includes exactly one precedent for a population existing in isolation without human knowledge: the Métis population in Wyoming. The conditions under which Métis survived as long as it did, relative isolation from the most intensive prairie dog poisoning campaigns, a specific combination of habitat characteristics that provided some buffer against the worst of the disease and persecution, were unusual enough that most researchers do not consider undocumented survival in the Great Plains a high prior probability hypothesis. But the Nebraska Panhandle has terrain characteristics that are worth considering. The Badlands and broken country in the western part of the state, in the region where the Pine Ridge meets the High Plains, includes areas of relatively low grazing pressure where prairie dog towns have persisted at densities unusual for privately managed ranch land. The terrain is not widely surveyed. Most of the land is private and has not been systematically looked at by wildlife researchers in the way that public land and tribal land have been during the recovery program's survey efforts. The absence of prior detection is not strong evidence of absence in terrain that has not been carefully searched. A third explanation, one that has been discussed in informal conversations among recovery program staff and independent researchers but has not been publicly advanced as a formal hypothesis, involves the possibility of undocumented or undisclosed translocation, meaning someone moved ferrets to this area intentionally without going through the formal channels of the recovery program. This explanation faces obvious questions about motive and logistics. The captive population of black-footed ferrets is carefully managed, individually identified, and inventoried with a precision that makes the disappearance of multiple animals without detection unlikely. An undisclosed translocation using captive animals would require access to the captive population and a willingness to circumvent a recovery program that has been built over decades with extraordinary care. It is not a credible explanation for the core of the sightings. But there is a version of this hypothesis that deserves some consideration, which is the possibility that someone in the region with knowledge of and access to the recovery program's reintroduction activities facilitated the movement of animals to suitable private land habitat without going through formal channels, motivated by a genuine conservation intent and a pragmatic impatience with the pace of the official process. This would not be unprecedented in conservation history. It would represent a serious breach of the protocols that give the recovery program its scientific integrity. It would also, if the animals have established and reproduced, represent an outcome that the recovery program would ultimately have to work with rather than against. The genetic question is the one that could, in principle, resolve some of the uncertainty about origins, and it is the reason why the recovery program's engagement with the Sioux County situation has been increasingly focused on getting biological samples from the animals that are being sighted. Camera trap images can confirm species identity. They cannot tell you whether an animal is descended from the Métis lineage, from one of the Wyoming reintroduction populations, from the South Dakota populations, or from something that does not fit any of the documented source populations in the expected way. Scat samples, hair samples caught on barbed wire or other substrate, and if possible, live captures for detailed biological sampling would provide the genetic data needed to begin reconstructing what is actually happening. The recovery program has been working towards sample collection with the cooperation of the landowners who have been most engaged, and the preliminary conversations about live trapping have been proceeding with the kind of careful negotiation that the landowner dynamics of the situation demand. What makes the situation particularly compelling from a conservation standpoint and this is something that the researchers closest to it have been careful about stating publicly, but less careful about in the informal conversations that have been happening among people paying close attention, is the habitat. The prairie dog towns on the private land in western Sioux County, where the sightings are concentrated, are large. Not large by pre-European contact standards. Not large enough to make anyone comfortable projecting a ferret population on the basis of habitat capacity alone, but large by contemporary Great Plains standards and connected in ways that suggest the kind of landscape-scale prairie dog infrastructure that the recovery program has identified as the limiting factor for black-footed ferret population growth across most of the species' former range. The prairie dog colonies in this area have not been subject to the systematic poisoning that has reduced colonies elsewhere in the region. The reasons for that are partly economic. Some of the land is less intensively grazed than adjacent properties, partly the result of individual landowner decisions not to pursue aggressive prairie dog management, and partly a function of terrain characteristics that make poisoning difficult. The outcome is a privately owned, unprotected, unsurveyed stretch of prairie dog habitat that is ecologically significant and sits in a region where it was not supposed to matter to black-footed ferret recovery because no ferrets were supposed to be there. The sylvatic plague situation in the area is the most serious biological complication to any scenario in which these animals are doing well. Sylvatic plague, caused by Yersinia pestis, is an introduced disease in North American rodent populations. It arrived in the early 20th century and has spread progressively through prairie dog populations across the Great Plains with a thoroughness that has been one of the recovery program's most persistent obstacles. Plague can eliminate a prairie dog colony in weeks. It can eliminate a ferret population that depends on that colony almost simultaneously. The recovery program has developed an oral bait vaccine for prairie dogs, distributed by hand or by drone, that provides significant protection against plague and has been deployed with growing effectiveness at established reintroduction sites. No plague management of any kind has been conducted in the area where the Sioux County sightings are occurring, because until recently there was no official acknowledgement that there was anything there to manage for. If there is a ferret population in that area, it is one plague event away from elimination, and plague events in the Nebraska Panhandle are not hypothetical. They have occurred in the region repeatedly over the past 2 decades. This is the point at which the story stops being simply interesting and starts being urgent. If there are black-footed ferrets on private land in Sioux County, Nebraska, without plague management in place, they are in a situation that is biologically precarious, in a way that the slow unfolding of landowner negotiations and agency protocols does not adequately account for. The recovery program's ability to intervene with plague management on private land is contingent on landowner agreement and on the formal establishment of a management relationship with the properties in question. That process is moving. It is not moving at the speed that the biological vulnerability of the situation might demand. The tension between the institutional pace of the recovery program, which is set by the complexity of the stakeholder relationships it has to manage, and the ecological clock that plague represents for an unprotected ferret population, is the central operational challenge of what is happening in Nebraska right now. The broader geographic context deserves attention, because the Sioux County situation does not exist in isolation. The Nebraska Panhandle sits at a convergence of habitat and history that makes it an ecologically logical place for black-footed ferrets to reappear, even if the mechanism by which they got there remains unclear. The region was historically part of the ferret's core range. The Oglala Lakota and the Cheyenne people who inhabited and traveled through this landscape before European contact documented ferrets in their material culture and in oral traditions in ways that reflect the animal's presence in the prairie dog towns of the High Plains. The systematic surveys that documented the final collapse of the Great Plains black-footed ferret population in the 1970s were not comprehensive enough to rule out persistence in the more isolated and less intensively surveyed corners of the Nebraska Panhandle, with the confidence that would make the current sightings impossible rather than merely surprising. The Pine Ridge country of northwestern Nebraska, where the terrain breaks down from the high plains into the dramatic Badlands formations that give the region some of its most distinctive character, has been a kind of ecological refuge for prairie grassland species that have been eliminated from more accessible and intensively managed parts of the region. The swift fox, another species that underwent dramatic range contraction in the 20th century, has been documented in this area in numbers that suggest persistence or natural recolonization in habitat where the species was thought to have been absent. The black-tailed prairie dog population in the Pine Ridge country, while not approaching historic densities, is sufficient to support a small ferret population if the animals were there to use it. The ecological pieces are not missing. What has been missing, officially, is the ferret. The relationship between the recovery program and the private landowners in the region where the sightings are occurring will determine everything about what happens next. There is a version of this story that ends well, in which the combination of voluntary landowner cooperation, carefully managed survey and genetic sampling, plague management deployed quickly enough to protect whatever is there, and a recovery program responsive enough to work with landowners on terms that make participation worth their while, produces the documentation and protection of what would be one of the most significant undocumented wildlife discoveries in the Great Plains in decades. There is another version that ends poorly, in which landowner hesitancy, regulatory concern, and institutional slowness allow a biologically significant but legally invisible ferret population to be eliminated by plague before anyone with the resources to help has an official relationship with the land it occupies. The people who are most optimistic about the good outcome are the ones who have been doing the work on the ground, in the region. The wildlife biologists, who have been making the drives out to western Nebraska to walk the prairie dog towns and talk to the ranchers. The conservation advocates, who have been building relationships with the landowner community over years before this situation emerged, and the recovery program staff, who have been quietly accelerating their engagement with the area since the sighting reports began to accumulate. The people who are most pessimistic are the ones who have watched other situations with similar configurations, an unexpected discovery on private land, regulatory complications, institutional pace mismatched with biological urgency, play out in ways that did not end with the species in question getting what it needed in time. There is a specific rancher in the Sioux County situation whose story deserves to be told with some detail, because it represents the kind of individual human dimension that gets lost in the institutional narrative of species recovery. His name is not being used here at his request, but he has been a consistent point of contact for the wildlife staff working the area, and his engagement with the situation reflects something genuine about the way some people in the ranching community think about the land and its history that is not captured by the standard portrayal of ranchers as adversaries of conservation. He is in his late 50s. His family has run cattle on the same section of western Sioux County for more than 70 years. He is not indifferent to prairie dogs. They create real management challenges on his land, and he has dealt with them accordingly over the course of his career. But he remembers his grandfather talking about ferrets. He remembers being told that the ferrets were gone, and feeling, as a young man, the particular grief of an extinction that happened on the landscape he grew up on and loved. When he started seeing animals on his property that he recognized from photographs and from his grandfather's descriptions, his first response was not to call an attorney or to worry about regulatory complications. His first response was to feel something he describes, simply, as relief. He has since thought harder about what the regulatory implications might be and has had conversations with legal counsel that have made him more cautious. He has not become an obstacle to the survey work. He has become a careful participant, someone who wants to know what is on his land and wants to manage it appropriately, but needs assurance that participating in the process will not result in outcomes for his operation that he cannot absorb. That assurance is not simple to provide, because the regulatory framework that applies to black-footed ferret presence on private land is not simple. The recovery program has tools available: safe harbor agreements, candidate conservation agreements, and other voluntary frameworks that can provide some regulatory predictability for landowners who participate in recovery efforts. Whether those tools are sufficient, whether they address the specific concerns of landowners in this situation in ways that make participation rational from their perspective, is something that the people working on the ground are testing in real time. The scientific dimensions of what might be happening in Nebraska have been generating interest in the broader ferret research community in ways that have not yet surfaced in published literature, but are visible in the conversations happening at the professional meetings and in the informal communications among researchers who pay close attention to the species. The possibility of a population that has been persisting on private land outside the managed recovery framework would have significant implications for the recovery program's understanding of the species' ability to establish itself in suitable habitat without intensive management support. The reintroduction program has been built on a set of assumptions about the degree of management intervention required to sustain a black-footed ferret population in the wild, including captive breeding support, plague management, prey base management, and predator management. Those assumptions are derived from the experience of managed reintroduction sites, and they may not reflect the species' potential in high-quality habitat with good prairie dog coverage and limited human disturbance, because no one has been watching what the species can do in that situation. If the Sioux County animals have been establishing and reproducing without any of those management inputs, it is information that the recovery program needs. The plague management question is the one that keeps the people closest to this situation up at night in a way that the other uncertainties do not, and it is worth being explicit about why. Plague epizootics in prairie dog colonies are not gradual. They move through a colony with a speed and completeness that is documented and terrifying from a conservation perspective. A prairie dog town of several hundred acres can go from full occupancy to empty in a matter of weeks during an active plague event. Black-footed ferrets have no resistance to plague. An infected ferret typically dies within days of exposure. A ferret population in an unmanaged prairie dog complex has no buffer against this outcome. The oral plague bait that the recovery program uses, sylvatic plague vaccine, or SPV, is effective when deployed consistently across a colony complex. It has transformed the management of plague risk at established reintroduction sites. It requires annual or biennial treatment. It requires aircraft or UAS distribution in larger complexes, and it requires a formal management relationship with the land on which it is deployed. None of these requirements are impossible to meet in the Sioux County context if the landowner relationships come together. All of them are contingent on those relationships coming together in time. The timeline concern is not abstract. The Nebraska Panhandle has experienced multiple plague events in prairie dog colonies over the past decade. The State Game and Parks Commission has been managing plague at prairie dog towns in the western part of the state, with a combination of dusting treatments and increasing use of oral bait. But the coverage has been limited by resources and by private land access constraints. The prairie dog towns where the ferret sightings have been concentrated are not currently receiving plague management. If there is an active ferret population on those towns, it is exposed. The window for getting protection in place before a plague event eliminates whatever is there is not indefinitely open. The people in the recovery program who are most urgently pushing to formalize the management relationship with the Sioux County landowners are doing so with this timeline in mind, and the urgency is appropriate. The camera trap effort that has been underway on properties where landowners have given permission has produced results that are being processed and evaluated with the kind of careful analytical approach that the significance of what they might show demands. Trail cameras deployed at active prairie dog burrow entrances at the edges of the colony complexes that have been the focus of sighting reports have captured images of multiple mustelid species, as prairie dog towns in this region attract badgers, long-tailed weasels, and least weasels, in addition to any ferrets that might be present. Distinguishing black-footed ferrets from these species in camera trap images requires image quality that is not always achieved in field conditions, and the process of reviewing the hundreds of thousands of images that a network of trail cameras generates over a survey season requires the kind of methodical attention that takes time. The preliminary review has identified a number of images that are being examined more closely. A formal statement about what those images contain is not yet available. The pace at which that formal statement is being developed reflects both the scientific rigor required by the stakes and the institutional caution appropriate to a situation with significant policy implications. What the sighting reports establish, independent of the camera trap results, is a pattern that is difficult to explain without some ferret presence in the area. The reports come from multiple independent observers on multiple separate properties over multiple seasons. They describe animals that match black-footed ferret physical description, including the distinctive black mask, black feet, and black tail tip that distinguish the species from other mustelids in the region. Several of the reports describe animals observed near or entering prairie dog burrows, which is behavioral confirmation that goes beyond visual description. The consistency of the reports across observers who did not know each other and who made their reports through different channels, in some cases years apart, is the kind of redundancy that strengthens the credibility of each individual account. The reports are not proof of a population. They are strong circumstantial evidence that the camera trap work is designed to move toward confirmation. The institutional response to the accumulation of this evidence has evolved over the course of the 3 years since the sightings began, coming in with enough frequency to demand attention. The initial response, polite acknowledgement, and logging of reports without significant field follow-up, reflected both the genuine uncertainty about how seriously to take the reports and the resource constraints of a state wildlife agency managing a large territory with a limited field staff. The response over the past year has been more active, with coordinated survey effort, engagement with the landowner community, and a growing formal partnership with the Black-Footed Ferret Recovery Program at the federal level. The United States Fish and Wildlife Service's Black-Footed Ferret Recovery Coordinator has been involved in the situation. The National Black-Footed Ferret Conservation Center in Colorado, which manages the captive breeding program and coordinates the recovery effort, has been engaged. The level of institutional attention that the Sioux County reports are now receiving reflects a consensus that has formed among the people closest to the situation that something is there, even if the formal documentation is not yet complete. The conservation community outside the recovery program has been following the Sioux County situation with a mixture of excitement and restraint. The excitement is straightforward. Black-footed ferrets appearing on private land outside any established recovery zone, potentially representing a wild population that established or persisted without formal management intervention, would be extraordinary. It would complicate the recovery program's narrative in useful ways. It would raise questions about what else might be possible in suitable habitat that has not been surveyed. It would represent a discovery of the kind that conservation biology rarely gets to make, with a species as intensively managed and closely monitored as the black-footed ferret. The restraint is equally understandable. Conservation organizations that have spent decades building the political and financial support for ferret recovery cannot afford to announce a discovery that subsequent investigation does not confirm. The credibility of the recovery program, the voluntary landowner partnerships it depends on, and the regulatory frameworks that support it are all better served by careful documentation than by premature claims about what is happening in Nebraska. This careful institutional posture is appropriate. It is also, from the perspective of telling the full story of what is happening, somewhat limiting. The people who are most certain that something significant is going on in Sioux County are not the ones making public statements. They are the field biologists who have walked those prairie dog towns, talked to the ranchers who have seen the animals, and looked at the preliminary camera trap results. What they are saying in those conversations, in the context of field work that is still ongoing and results that are still being evaluated, represents the kind of confidence that does not translate directly into official communications, but that conveys a level of certainty that is useful for understanding where this is likely to go. The longer history of the Great Plains and what it has lost puts the Sioux County situation in a frame that matters for understanding its significance, beyond the black-footed ferret specifically. The grassland ecosystem of the central and northern Great Plains is one of the most severely degraded large natural systems in North America. The tallgrass prairie is functionally gone, converted to agriculture at rates that make it among the most transformed biomes in the world. The shortgrass and mixed grass prairie of the high plains and the panhandle country has fared better in terms of total acreage, but has been deeply restructured by a century and a half of intensive livestock production, water management, and the systematic removal of native wildlife that posed any perceived competition with or threat to agricultural production. The black-footed ferret's story is the extreme case, an animal taken to the edge of existence by the transformation of the system it depended on. The prairie dog story is arguably more representative of the high plains generally, a keystone species reduced to a fraction of its former abundance and ecological function. Its role in structuring the grassland ecosystem diminished proportionally. The places where that historical damage is less complete, where the connections between native grassland species and the habitat structures that support them have not been entirely severed, are the places where recovery is most plausible and where unexpected persistence is most conceivable. The broken country of the Nebraska Panhandle, with its mix of difficult terrain, private ownership patterns that have kept some ground out of intensive production, and the remnant prairie dog infrastructure that has survived in the Pine Ridge country, is exactly the kind of place where you would look for species that should not still be there, according to the simplified narrative of Great Plains ecological history. The Sioux County ferret situation is, in this reading, less a surprise than a reminder that the landscape is more complicated than the summary statistics of habitat loss suggest, and that the biology of persistence in degraded systems is capable of producing outcomes that careful ecological accounting might not have predicted. The precedents for unexpected carnivore or mustelid discoveries on private land in the Great Plains and adjacent regions are worth noting because they provide context for evaluating the plausibility of what the Sioux County reports suggest. Swift foxes were documented naturally recolonizing portions of their former range in the central Great Plains, years before formal reintroduction efforts began in some of those areas, moving through private ranch land without the assistance of any management program and establishing small populations in habitat that suitable desktop analysis would have identified as adequate, but that no one was actively looking at for the species. River otters have been documented in Nebraska drainage systems years ahead of any formal restoration effort, presumably moving up from reintroduced populations in Missouri and Iowa. The North American wolverine has been documented making long-distance movements through the northern Great Plains that represent individual excursions well beyond the documented current range boundary. Carnivore and mustelid movement on the landscape is not bounded by the maps that recovery programs produce, and the discovery of individuals or small groups in locations that the official range maps do not include is less surprising to people who study animal movement than it is to the institutional frameworks that manage species recovery. This does not mean the Sioux County ferrets are definitely a wild, self-sustaining population. The documentation is not there yet. It means that the presence of one or more black-footed ferrets on private land in western Nebraska, even at a distance from the nearest formal reintroduction site that exceeds what standard dispersal modeling would predict, is not biologically impossible and should not be treated as such. The question is not whether ferrets could be there. The question is, what is there, in what numbers, how they got there, and whether the conditions exist to ensure they survive long enough to be properly understood and managed. Those questions are answerable, but they require the kind of sustained, well-resourced field effort and landowner partnership that the situation is only now beginning to generate at the scale it demands. The people who will determine the outcome of this situation are not primarily the wildlife biologists, as important as their work is. They are the landowners, the ranchers and their neighbors who control the private land where the prairie dog towns are and where the ferrets, if they are there, live and hunt, and if they are reproducing, raise their young in the borrowed architecture of the species they depend on entirely. The conservation community's ability to do right by whatever is happening in Sioux County is contingent on relationships that take time to build, and that cannot be built on the assumption that regulatory compliance is an adequate substitute for genuine partnership. The rancher, who felt relief when he saw an animal his grandfather had told him was gone, that emotion is not nothing. It is a foundation. What the recovery program and the conservation community build on it will reflect, more than any technical or scientific consideration, whether the American model of private land conservation is capable of rising to the occasion when an opportunity that no one planned for appears on the landscape. The ferret does not know it is significant. It does not know it is listed under the Endangered Species Act, or that it is the subject of one of the most intensive recovery programs in conservation history, or that its appearance on a ranch in Sioux County, Nebraska, is generating the kind of quiet urgency in wildlife management circles that tends to precede either a significant discovery or a significant loss. It knows the prairie dog town. It knows the burrows. It knows the pattern of hunting that its physiology and instinct have shaped it for.